Good evening and welcome on behalf of President Jennifer Rabb, who actually asked me specifically to organize this event in celebration of Stonewall. This is our 7th panel in the celebration of Stonewall, and I have done a lot of events at this podium in the last 2 years, but I have never had more intellectual firepower in one place and more history in one place than we have here this evening. Ed White is at the end of our table, a dear friend, an extraordinarily generous person, and the most prolific and perhaps most celebrated gay writer of our time, the author of a dozen novels, including The Farewell Symphony, Boy's Own Story, 4 nonfiction books, biographies of Genet, Proust, and Rimbaud, and 5 memoirs. Along with Larry Kramer, he is one of the founders of the Gay Men's Health Crisis. He was also appointed to the Francis Ordre des Arts et des Lettres, to the American Academy of Arts and Letters, and to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. And he and Jim Forat have known each other since about 1962, perhaps? Jim is a producer, organizer, writer, editor, manager, consultant, and has been inciting, shaping, fomenting, and provoking American culture for over 50 years. He worked for Clive Davis. I'm most jealous because you knew Lauren Euro, who was my personal goddess of the 1960s. Bob Dylan, Miles Davis, Simon and Garfunkel, The Byrds, and Sly Stone. He was at the Monterey Pop Festival, at Woodstock, at Newport, and Altamont, and he was a participant in the Stonewall Rebellion that marked the birth of our movement. He also acted with Lee Strasberg, and he's a member of Actors Equity. Carl Charles is a staff attorney in the New York office of the Lambda Legal Defense, the oldest and largest organization dedicated to advancing the civil rights of lesbians, gay men, bisexuals, transgender, and people living with AIDS. During his time as Lambda Legal, Carl has been involved in litigating a number of cases, expanding and solidifying federal civil rights protections for transgender people. Most recently, he has been counsel in Karnosky versus Trump, the federal lawsuit challenging the constitutionality of the Trump administration's ban on transgender soldiers. Anne Pellegrini is a professor of performance studies and social and cultural analysis at NYU. Her books include Performance Anxieties, Staging Psychoanalysis, Staging Race, and she is co-author with Janet Jacobson, can you say that, Jacobson, of Love and Sin, Sexual Regulation, and the Limits of Religious Tolerance, and with Michael Bronsky and Michael Amico of You Can Tell Just by Looking, and 20 Other Myths about LGBT life and people. She's co-editor of the journal Studies in Gender and Psychoanalysis and is currently completing a new book on queer structures of religious feeling. Rich, did I do you, Rich? I didn't do you, did I? Rich? Rich Benjamin is the author of Searching for Whitopia, an improbable journey to the heart of white America, selected as an editor's choice by Booklist. This groundbreaking study was one of the first books to document the resurgence of white anxiety and white nationalism in America. He's a regular contributor to the New York Times, The New Yorker, The Guardian, MSNBC, NPR, and most recently, the Los Angeles Times. And we are here to recall some of the great moments of our past and to talk about what we hope will happen in the future. And Ed White, since you were walking by that night at the Stonewall Inn, can you recreate the scene for us a little bit, both what it was like inside and outside that institution?
It was a very hot night, and people, I think, were restless. A lot of people are out like now, and people were sitting on stoops, and I was walking by with a friend, and we saw all these people gathered in front of the Stonewall. And so we were curious about what was going on. And we realized that there had been a paddy wagon, or a Black Maria, or whatever you call it, that had scooped up lots of people, but there were too many people to take them all. So the rest were inside, barricaded inside the bar with a number of policemen and mostly the staff, some drag queens. And anyway, So while we were waiting for the paddy wagon to come back, people got very angry and rebellious and began to batter down the doors and light fires in wastebaskets. And in general, and I was such a little middle-class nerd, I kept saying, oh, don't object to the police. And, but then it kind of got beyond me. I sort of was excited and found all this anger come rushing out. I'd been on the couch for 20 years trying to go straight and had ruined the lives of 2 different women. And so then I suddenly felt liberated in a way that I had never really felt before. But I mean, because I said to somebody recently that we went into Stonewall as a mental illness and we came out as a minority. And it really was, I mean, like most of these important political acts are rubbish. They don't really, the event, I mean, the necessity for the event is there, but the event itself is usually misguided. I mean, after all, the Stonewall was a mafia bar, zero hygiene. They had no running water. Everybody, it was filthy and horrible. And but anyway, it was our Bastille. The Bastille only had 6 people in it. One of them, the Marquis de Sade, who clearly belonged there. So, you know, so I just think that these great historic events are oftentimes ill-chosen, but no matter, because I really felt like that event changed so much. I moved away for a year to Rome, and then when I came back, everything was different. And I mean, there had been so few gay bars, and now there were hundreds, it seemed, with go-go boys and everybody, back rooms, everything, and all kinds of groups like the Gay Academic Union, and then
And the Gay Liberation Front.
yes,
And the Gay Activist Alliance.
that's right. One radical, one moderate, and so on. Anyway, all those things had developed in the meanwhile, and I joined a Maoist consciousness-raising group, and where you choose a topic like religion and gayness, and then you would each bear testimony, but you had no right to criticize anybody. You couldn't say, "Oh no, you're wrong." You had to just accept everything everybody said. That was Maoism.
And do you think of this as the starting point of the modern gay liberation movement, or how do you feel about it as an historical event?
I mean, a lot of people quibble with that and say, well, there were things on the West Coast. And of course, in the 1920s, there had been Magnus Hirschfeld in Germany.
In Germany, yeah.
And I was just there at the Schwules Museum, the Faggot Museum, and where they were giving a big tribute to Christopher Isherwood, who lived in the Institute for Sexuality.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Anne, do you think of it as the beginning of the modern liberation movement or not?
In a word, no. I think I should say I'm not trained as a historian. I think critically about the category of history, which is a slightly different way of thinking history, I suppose. I mean, I think we might want to wonder together about how it is that Stonewall came to be constituted as the originary moment of gay and lesbian liberation. Is there an American exceptionalism to telling the story that way? Many of you might be aware that the Stonewall celebrations this weekend coincide with World Pride, which takes place every few years. World Pride is an international gathering. It's incorporated in the United States, though, so it brings together local pride organizers throughout the world, and they sort of basically do a competition. They do a bid, basically. They put together a bid so that World Pride would be held in their city. And then for, I think, $50,000, they get the branding rights to World Pride if their bid is accepted. So World Pride this year is happening at Stonewall. And I mention this because, again, I wanted us to think about the global travel of Stonewall as a story also that centers the United States and also centers New York, and so disappears earlier activisms that were happening in the US and elsewhere, and also disappears what was happening in San Francisco, for example, and in Chicago and other major metropolitan areas in the United States around what we could then call homophile organizing that preceded Stonewall and continued after it. So again, I don't have an answer to why Stonewall became that event that got set down as the myth of origins. I do think some of it had to do with how good New Yorkers are at making themselves the center of the universe. I say that as someone who's not native to New York. But I really think it matters how we tell the story of Stonewall also.
And it was rebellious.
It was rebellious.
It was violent and rebellious, which everybody liked.
Very satisfying story,
Yeah,
right?
you know, like Daughters of Bilitis and Mattachine had been very well-bred groups, and this was not a well-bred group.
But
So it had a
also,
revolutionary fervor.
Jim, was there not an explosion of organizational activity? Within a month, the Gay Liberation Front was handing out my favorite pamphlet, which asked, "Do you think homosexuals are revolting?" And the answer was, "You bet your sweet ass we are."
I asked Charles if I could have a little sign that went around my neck that would say reality check. Because my good old friend at the other end of the table gave you a wonderful telling of the myth of Stonewall. And I happened to have been standing in front of the place at 10:30 at night. And I will tell you, there, under no dictionary definition, did the event that took place qualify as a riot. I looked at them all. There was no looting, there's no people out of control. The arrest was very, very small. The hospital records only had 3 policemen who came in with fake injury and were immediately released. The fire department was around the corner. There were no fires. Now, someone might have thrown a match. Now, you see, the power of the imagination and the power of myth has taken over this whole thing. And I feel like I am like this old curmudgeon saying, that didn't happen, that, because I think what actually did happen was more important. In no way diminishes, because it doesn't fit the straight 60s template of what we do in political action. And I think that the media, in many ways, tried to do that. And Mattachine Society, which was the most visible homophile organization, very much was upset by what happened and tried to make it into a riot. They continued to say that these people were out of control. They did things. Now, what did happen? I'll be very quick. Cut me off, Charles, when I go on too much, please. There was a woman that was taken out of the bar at 10:45 by one of the 2 police officers that had shown up to get their payoff. Now, if you look at the reporting on the Stonewall 50, you don't hear anything about that. You hear about a raid that happened at midnight. Well, let me tell you, it was systemic within the police department because organized crime, for my Italian friends, I'll say organized crime. For the rest of you, we can say the mafia or the mob. They provided these safe spaces where gay and lesbian people, separate bars, could go and be social with each other. Otherwise, gay men had bushes, bathhouses, and toilets. You know, it was depersonalizing, it was hot, it was sexy, but it wasn't integrated into person. And so you'll hear people conflicted about, yes, we went to the Stonewall, which was not the most popular bar. The most popular bar was a real dance bar called the Cherry Lane, which is about 3 blocks away, which no one seems to mention anymore. And there were other bars. It was a sleazy, dirty place where mostly closeted men went to meet young men who needed to have dinner paid for or to buy some drugs. There was a jukebox there. A couple of drag queens might be let in. It was not a place for drag queens, given the population that went in there. Martin Duberman's book, Cures, will tell you the emotional life of most gay men at that particular time. But his romantic, 30 years later, he's suddenly dancing in Stonewall, and it's all, The role of myth is something that I think about, and these are more intellectually thoughtful people than perhaps I am, about what is the role of myth? Why do people want to call it all these other things which actually did not happen? And I've come to terms with that. Sylvia was not there. Sylvia Rivera was not there. Sylvia and Marcia have been fetishized beyond anything, but I knew who they were. They were my friends. I know how they behaved. But in the current popular myth of them and other black trans women, words that were never spoken until much, 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 much later, or were throwing bricks. I don't know. They must have brought them in their purses, which they didn't carry because there are no bricks on Christopher Street. So I think it's a question I would ask all of us. Why do we go towards this kind of dramatic, what I call heterosexual political kind of activity of the 60s, rather than celebrating? Now, I'm going to tell you something which is taboo and forbidden. It's probably why I don't get asked to speak at World Pride or at HOP. That first night when they brought the woman out, she was a passing woman, sometimes called a bull dyke. That was a bad word, the passing woman meaning a woman that dressed so much like a man that she could pass. And she could pass. Put her in the car. I don't know what happened in the bar. She must have spoken out. There are really very few women that ever went into this band, but there's a certain kind of lesbian that does hang out with the boys rather than the girls because they're afraid of the girls, quite frankly, is what I've been told by the women that do hang out with the boys rather than the girls. And they put her in the car. There were two cops, one cop inside, one car brought her out, put her in the car, went back inside. She started rocking, true to her gender expression, being as butch as she could possibly be. One of the car doors opened up, much to her surprise, much to the surprise of about 45 people that now were standing in the street, outside the bar. And she jumped out, and she also had small little wrists, considering how masculine she was trying to be, and she slipped out of her handcuffs to raise her hands up. And people cheered. It was like, I don't know if any of you have ever been to a really good gay disco at a peak moment when all the music has been built by the DJ, you get to that moment, he cuts out the sound, and everybody is cheering. You hear all this celebration. That was more the spirit of what was going on. Why? Because gay and lesbian people were not allowed to be out in those places. We're not allowed to be out in the left or the right. So I think we really should be true to who our real spirit is. It was very celebratory, cheering her on. Cop comes out. She's not in the car. Looks at the people, and this is Saturday night. More people are coming down on the street. They're now blocking traffic in the street. Christopher Street is the main street in the village, the bus line. And he freaks and goes back inside. I assume that he called for reinforcements. Then that's where the story becomes interesting, because what you read about is a raid, and what the chief of police apologized for was a raid. What was the raid for? Well, there was supposed to be prostitution and pickpocketing. You hear all these press releases coming from the police department. But who was arrested? The 7 employees of the bar. That's who normally is arrested. I ran nightclubs that had those people in the back room. You had to deal with them. That's who usually was arrested. They weren't picking up anybody else, nor was anyone else charged with these outrageous or really awful charges. And there may have been prostitution. Yes, there was prostitution. Of course there was prostitution. That's why the men were there for most of the boys. That was a cover-up. The inspector that was there in charge, Seymour Prime, a good man I knew from the East Village when I was doing political organizing against the war, but his job was to cover up the systemic payoff system within the police department. And they've been very successful because World Pride, HOP, whatever, no one talks about. I'm listening to NPR now. I trust NPR to some degree to be somehow accurate. And they're talking about the most popular bar in the village. They don't talk about the police, about the systemic payoff, about why. It's illegal to serve alcohol. Illegal to serve alcohol to homosexuals, male or female. I'll stop there.
It was a bottle club. That was the way they got around it. You had to sign in, as Elizabeth Taylor or Judy Garland. Rich, do you remember when you first heard about Stonewall growing up as a gay man? Have you always been aware of this event?
So, as the member of Gen X on this panel, I was not at Stonewall. I hadn't yet been born. The way I heard about Stonewall was through college history class. They certainly didn't teach it in elementary school, middle school, nor high school. I didn't learn about it until college. And by the way, I took a class in lesbian and gay studies, and at that time, even in the 1990s, one was extremely fearful. The mere fact of attending such a class tagged you as gay. So,
A friend of mine took gay lit, but he told his parents it was Gaelic.
Yeah.
Carl, when were you first aware of this event in our history?
As the proud millennial on this panel, I was born eons after Stonewall and did not learn about it until I came out as transgender. And, I grew up in Colorado Springs, actually, which some of you may be familiar with, home of 5 military bases and Focus on the Family and more evangelical nonprofits per capita than anywhere else in the country. And so, it was not something I learned about either during the conversion therapy I was subjected to there in Colorado Springs. So I came about our history through my own discovery and very much was invested for a great deal of time in the myths, the story. And I think for me, it gave me a sense of belonging and a history that I had heretofore never really connected with or understood. And so I was really invested in that myth until I learned better. And I think for a lot of us who come from places that don't really give us a sense of history in our community, I think that narrative can be really powerful.
Well, I think the myth is very important. It was important to create the myth, and I think that the reason that it became the beginning point, in public at least, is because of the marches that took place 1 year after it in New York and Los Angeles and Chicago and San Francisco. I think those were the marches which made it the event that we then celebrated over and over and over again. And of course, there were lots of other activities before it. And Frank Kameny was hard at work. Frank, I believe, is the single most important person in the history of the movement. And he was hard at work before Stonewall. And in fact, in 1968, when he saw Stokely Carmichael on TV say, "Black is beautiful," it was Frank who invented "gay is good." But we don't only want to look back tonight, we also want to look forward. And Carl, you're in a particularly important battle looking forward. Can you tell us where we stand in the war against the Trump administration's war against trans soldiers?
So the ban against open trans military service went into effect on April 12th of this year, despite our very best attempts, along with many of our sister organizations, including the National Center for Lesbian Rights, the ACLU, and GLAAD, Single A GLAAD. We've been battling this since it first happened in the summer of 2017, and unfortunately, we are learning that several of our plaintiffs are being forced to endure conditions that may lead to their eventual discharge or to their own choice to leave the military, right? So it's really mirroring a lot of the conditions we saw under Don't Ask, Don't Tell. The policy did not allow trans people who are not in the military to enlist, so many of our plaintiffs are prevented from even enlisting, and the folks who are not out are certainly not motivated to come out now, and are sort of waiting to see how this plays out. I think we're going to continue to challenge it in all the ways we can, but it really is an uphill battle. We did receive a favorable ruling from the Ninth Circuit about 3 weeks ago that said that a policy like this does actually target transgender people. The government is trying to say, "Oh no, we don't target transgender people. We target people with gender dysphoria." But the court, right, the same thing. The court really, sort of poignantly said and quoted all of the government's words that actually said transgender people with gender dysphoria and italicized transgender people. So, the court has said that policy is subject to intermediate scrutiny, which is legalese for, sort of middle of the road scrutiny, which means the policy does have to be analyzed without normal deference to the government. So, we're optimistic, we're pressing forward, and I think, really what this is about in our minds, as much as it is a legal battle, it's about a battle against this rhetoric that has been unleashed from this administration, right? Which is harming trans people in every component of our lives. Not just military service, but in access to healthcare. We're no longer able, potentially now, to access emergency shelters. And for those of us who are really forced to the margins, right? Transgender people of color, people in crisis who are seeking emergency shelters away from various types of rejection. We are, we're faced with discrimination at every turn. So we're really trying to fight back against this rhetoric, but it is spreading quickly. So.
Rich, you had a very interesting article last week in the Los Angeles Times about gays and women and abortion. And would you like to talk a little bit about how we need to ally ourselves more strongly with the women's movement, if I'm not misinterpreting what you wrote?
Yeah, so Charles is referring to, thank you for mentioning that. He's referring to an article in last Sunday's LA Times. And what inspired the article is I was kind of having some ambivalence about Pride, marching and celebrating, giving all the dumpster fire shitstorm that everyone's living through, including women, and all the restrictive abortion rights clauses. So I did an experiment, and I asked well-plugged-in women, who do they think are more sexist, straight men or gay men? And the answer kind of surprised me. They said equally both. And so that inspired me to write, have gay men lived up to feminism? Have we really stood up for what is going on in terms of women's lives, in terms of unequal pay, in terms of women in immigration, in terms of the restrictive abortion rights? And we should have seen this coming in the Obama administration. How many people remember Cecil Richards being grilled by the Senate for these fake doctored fetal cells as a pretext? So we saw it coming along. And the final piece of the article was, my generation and the millennial generation, we have this mentality of post, we're post-work. We don't believe in work, we're post-racial, we're post-feminist, we're post-everything. And I think that declaration is premature in the same way post-racial is premature. So the article just asked, what, if anything, do gay men owe women? And it also speculated the extent to which gay men acquire more child adoption rights and more marriage rights. That doesn't necessarily make us more feminists. It might simply strengthen our empathy to entitled straight men. So that's what the article asked.
And are gay men more sympathetic to the women's movement or not than their
I-
straight counterparts?
I can't answer that question demographically, but I think that the points that Rich is raising are so important, because what we've seen, and this, if we think about how we tell the story of Stonewall and why it matters, if we tell the story of Stonewall as becoming a movement about a single issue, sexuality, we lose out in the way that the politics of Stonewall were intersectional from the beginning, because so many of the people that went on to do organizing in the immediate wake of Stonewall were already doing organizing, because they were already plugged into already existing social movements of that era against the war. They were plugged into Black Power. There was, emergent, what gets called second wave women's liberation movement. So there was an energy that was also lateral, that was connecting people in alliance. And why do I bring this up in the connection to that Rich is bringing up? If we focus on the single issue, we then say that Stonewall's energies take us to the same-sex marriage movement. The same-sex marriage movement, and Lord knows if the government is going to give 1,000 benefits to married couples that aren't otherwise easily available, same-sex couples should get them on equal terms. Done with that, all right? But the focus on marriage is a focus on sexual respectability. It equates granting of equal rights with performing your sexuality in ways that are seen to be responsible, where marital sexuality is thought to be the most responsible form. That is bad for women. That is bad for women, because women who need abortion, for whatever reason they may need an abortion, are then being accused of being irresponsible. So the same-sex marriage movement, and this was not its intention, it has contributed to an ongoing public conversation which is impossible to defend women's and girls' access to reproductive justice, including to abortion and contraception, because such access is seen as epitomizing sexual irresponsibility. Right? So this is not about our individual gay men more sexist than straight men. In some sense, I don't care about that question. I'm actually thinking about the organization of public conversation, the space to make certain kinds of claims. And the same-sex marriage movement narrowed the ways that narrowed the space to make claims for sexual justice in a much broader way. And it actually, I think, it closed down some of the imagined space for making the arguments for, again, for abortion and contraception. And this is even worse for poor women, and disproportionately then also for women of color.
Ed White and Jim, did you feel the tension that I felt for many decades between wanting to have the right to marry and not wanting to emulate this specifically heterosexual institution?
Can I answer a different question?
Okay, okay.
I think, like, if we're talking about the future of the gay movement,
Yeah.
the third world is the thing I really want to concentrate on, because, I was a teacher until 2 years ago, and people would say to me, "Oh, why are you still making such a fuss? I mean, hasn't everything been solved? And you gays have been given everything." And first of all, I had lots of students who were from religious right families and who were suffering. And this is at Princeton, and they were suffering terribly. They were wearing purity rings, the girls, to show that they hadn't had sex. Their father would put the ring on them during a ceremony, anyway, at church.
Yeah.
And I had so many students who would get mad at me and storm out of the room because I'm an outspoken atheist. But anyway, I think that in America, there's still a huge group of people who are oppressed and who are not yet freed, and that includes many of the children of the religious right. But I think another thing is that we shouldn't forget that people are still being executed for being gay, and that every year there's another story about that, and I think it's a very people think, oh well, all of our problems have been solved. No, they haven't. I mean, for probably a majority of people living in the former Soviet countries, or living in Muslim countries, or even parts of South America, there's still tremendous oppression.
Jim?
Religion, organized religion, is the single most aggressive homophobic institution in the world. It's a worldwide assault upon homosexuality or same-sex love. Let's be clear about that. I'm not talking about spirituality. I think some of my best communist friends I felt were spiritual. They didn't like it when I said that, but I thought the things that spiritual is about is not about institutional religion. I got up at a Gay Liberation Front meeting about maybe 6 weeks after we started, and I said this. I said, I cannot be a misogynist or sexist because I'm a gay man. Now, we had gotten a lot of the women that had been kicked out of the women's liberation movement who were lesbians. They came into the Gay Liberation Front in that first year before they branched out over to work with women. And they very kindly but very strongly said to me that that wasn't true, Jim, and you better get yourself into a consciousness raising group, and we're not going to teach you what you're going to learn. And I did that, and I will tell you that since that point, I am so grateful to those women. And I read those books. I read Germaine Greer rather than Karl Marx, and I read, people like that, because my politics have fundamentally been feminist. And since that, and a lot of gay men don't have that, and a lot of the organized gay male community, the political community, do not have that either. And that gets me in trouble. But I will tell you about, in the first meeting of the Gay Liberation Front, we called a town hall meeting. We heard Mattachine was going to have a meeting because they wanted to prove to America and to the media that gay men, mostly, a few women belonged to Mattachine, were really nice people. They wanted to have a candlelight march the second night around the village and show how nice and presentable we were. Now, I've come to believe that people like Frank Kameny and the people that existed in the 60s in the homophile movement, in fact, those men are actually heroes. But I can tell you in 1969, that is not how I felt about them. I remember we said things like, time's up, you're over, we don't want to be like straight people, we don't want, we're not, we're different, we want to be gay, we want to be lesbian, et cetera, et cetera. But I've learned, as I've gotten older, the courage it took to do that. But marriage, the radical women's very strong critique about marriage. Slavery, I think, was one of the words that was used, and very much opposed to it. So that first meeting, about 150 people came that really represented the diversity of who this community is, as opposed to how the media always presented it as white gay men. There were old and young, there were fat and thin, there were people of color, there were different economic strata among these 150 people that showed up. And they had never been in a meeting that was not in a bar. This is I'm only talking about my experience. Other people may have other experiences. And at that meeting, the women brought in some of the tools that they had in women's liberation. They brought in a talisman. Now, this is a Native American tradition, but a little talking stick. And we said, everyone's going to have 3 minutes. And you don't have to say anything, but that 3 minutes is yours. Pass it around. Half the room could not speak. They had never had the experience of talking about themselves as homosexuals or lesbians in a public space.
Well, nobody had in 1969, pretty much. Well, I mean, except for occasional people, the Daughters of Bilitis and the Mattachine Society, but virtually everybody who was gay was invisible as a gay person.
Not the people that were forming the Gay Liberation Front, by the way.
Right.
But no, what happened was the rest of the people in the room that did speak, what did they say over and over and over again? I want to hold my girlfriend's hand when I walk down the street. I want to marry the man that I'm in love with. Over and over again, and this little silent scream went off in the lesbian corner. And I had my little red book, my little Mal book, and it said, listen to the people. It's much easier to read that book than some of those other books at that. And it bothered me that they really, that's what they thought, that's what they were there with, was to get married. We wanted revolution in our lifetime. That's what people like me wanted. We wanted to change the world and for everybody. And I will tell you, I got married last Sunday.
Yay.
I got married in the Stonewall Monument, which was, get a permit for that was like Jesus. But I wanted to do that because of what I see is going on now. Women are going to lose the right to control their body. I'm convinced that one of those 50 cases, and Charles may tell me, you may tell me differently, and I don't think that they say marriage equality because they don't have to say sex in it. I'm very glad that Anne said it's same-sex civil marriage. That is what the law is about. It's not about religion. It's not about anything like that. But I think that that's not far behind. The same forces that organize and organize very well to go after women's right to control their body is going to come after us. And a 74-year-old man asked a 78-year-old gay man, turned 78 on Sunday, the day I got married. You don't know how many times I've done that in a meeting, and you just want to die. And he asked me to marry him. And I thought, my head's thinking, we don't need to get married. When we're old, some of the things that Anne talked about are very, very real. Almost all of my friends died in the AIDS pandemic, okay? I'm an only child. I have no extended family. And I didn't want to be one of those old gay people that stinks so much when they're dead on the floor that they break into the apartment and find you. And so I was looking for some way of being less self-reliant on that level. And so I thought about it, and it was really strange. He really loves me for who I am. And I'm not used to that, quite frankly. And I love him. And why not? It's not about children. It's not about career. But it is a political statement for me. And I had to go, journalists kept saying, what is the one thing that you've achieved in 50 years? And I would think about this, and I think about that, and I think about this, and I think about that. And I finally realized it was marriage equality, because we defeated the churches. We defeated the churches. that the people that did that fight, who I had little respect for, I didn't put them on the top of my hit list, you know? I had to go back and apologize to a number of people who had stuck with that and got marriage equality passed. And, you know, it's about choice. Nobody says you have to get married. I want to make sure everyone understands that, particularly you millennials. You know, you don't have to get married. You don't have to have children. Parenting is a vocation, and you better have it if you want to have kids, because that's one thing that gay and lesbian families have taught straight people. Those children are wanted. They are really wanted. They're not accidents or gift from God. They're really wanted. So so I've come full circle about what is the future. I just want to throw one thing into this little conversation. Language. The toxic effect of language. I find it's like I'm in the early 70s when Comitel Pro was following me around as a white person. They usually went after brown and black people. And because I spoke at a Black Panther rally. And, you know, we're divided amongst ourselves. I'm a person that helped build identity politics for gay and lesbian people. And I'm using the language that we used at that particular historical time. But it was never to be what I see today. You know, it was to know who you are. So you can stand up and just be who you are, one person, your sexuality, your emotional life, your whatever, all in one. When you meet Jim, you meet Jim. This is me, all, in all the different situations. And I really wanted that, but I didn't want it to, Harry Hay taught me this. He said, we have to figure out what it means to be gay. Frank said, gay is good. Well, what is gay? Is it a reaction to homophobia? Is it a reaction to oppression? The drag queen in your face, you know? The drag queens were the best political group that I knew of because they really critiqued gender long before anyone else did it, if they weren't hating women. And I don't think every drag queen hated a woman, by the way.
Mary Bonanno, who is one of the key lawyers in the fight for marriage equality, and I think she describes the circle that we went through quite well. She said she went from thinking that the idea that I need to be married seemed fanciful, even sort of crazy, but then after Bill Clinton signed the Defense of Marriage Act, she was enough of a student to understand it has always been better for a group to be different by choice than to be discriminated against by the law, which is why she felt it was so important to change the law. Do we have any questions from the audience? Sir.
I have a question about the future, but I just wanted to comment on your discussion about myth. I was reminded of a film that came out about 60 years ago, in which a journalist discovers the fact of who really killed Liberty Valance. And he comments that when myth conflicts with reality or with fact, print the myth. And I think that's what's happened with Stonewall. But my question is about this new Harris poll that just came out in the last few days that shows that the younger generation is less supportive of LGBT rights and feels less comfortable with family members who are LGBT. What are your thoughts about this? It's the first time there's been a decline in the history of the poll. So I was curious as to if you had any thoughts about that.
Anne, do you have a reaction?
Yeah, I think it's actually quite fascinating. And I haven't really taken a deep dive into it in terms of the numbers, you know, sort of the parameters of it. I mean, one thought I'm having is that I think it puts an important stop potentially into the fantasy that we have. And I think this is a fantasy, this is a secular progress narrative. It only gets better. That's just not true. This administration is proof that it doesn't only get better. And the arc of history doesn't just move automatically towards increasing progress. So in that sense, this is an importantly sobering moment just to take these data in. But if we think about also generational sort of exposure, on the one hand, you know, there are more, let's say, LGBT characters on television shows that people are exposed to in the media in their classrooms. But it may well be that you know, there is much more sort of hateful public discourse right now, perhaps to the extent that there's the perception, not the reality, the perception that the gay movement's done. We got what we wanted, same-sex marriage. Never mind the fact that this is the paradox, right? And I'm saying something that so pretty much everyone in this room knows. In most of this country, you can let's say you publish your wedding banns in the paper. It's announced that you got married in a same-sex marriage. You can have that published on Sunday and be fired on Monday. And in most of the country, you have no legal redress for that. You can be fired still for being gay, and it's even worse if you're trans, right? So there's a huge gap between the perception that the movement's over, we've achieved what we wanted, and the actual fact. And I think that perception then can lead to the notion that, well, these people, why are they still complaining? I mean, that it may actually then lend towards a kind of, sort of less surety about, am I supposed to ally with this? I say all this at the same time that I'm actually quite surprised by the data. It doesn't square with the young people whom I'm encountering in my classrooms at all. So I want to know who was polled and where. And I'm so curious what the two of you are thinking about these data.
I haven't seen the data or numbers either, but I love Anne's comment about this American assumption that history always gets better and there's this geological progress. And I reviewed a book called Victory, written by an ally of ours, a straight woman, a brilliant feminist historian, who basically said, it's a wonderful history, by the way, if you want to read the history, but when she talks about the future, she declared victory, and that was way premature, and I wouldn't be surprised if we saw a ferocious anti-gay backlash in the way that we saw an anti-black backlash and an anti-female backlash in the last, let's say, 10, 15 years.
Carl, are you nervous about this?
Yes. I want to echo Rich's comment and just say that, from a legal history perspective, the folks on the far right were watching what happened in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, and they watched us build power, and they watched us love each other and care for each other and band together to fight against oppression. And they planned and they plotted, and now they're packing the courts. They saw what we did, with the Warren Court. They saw what we did, in building structural power and responding to political oppression.
And right now, they're much more organized than we are.
They are, and they've been. I mean, you can see this literally. You can read about it in Clarence Thomas's Dissents. Like, take a look at the stuff that is coming from that guy's pen. It is terrifying, and he is setting the stage for these new justices to overturn the progress that we collectively, and I use we capital like across social justice movements, if I can call it that. They are plotting to turn all that, and I think they've been very detailed and very specific, and the Federalist Society, and they have created a pipeline, and that's
And they've just appointed 60 of the worst judges in history.
Yeah, truly. And we are Lambda Legal, where I work, is doing a lot of monitoring on those appointments, and you can check out our website and see what we're doing. But the Senate is still the Senate, despite our advances in the House, and we have a real uphill battle. And I think, as much as it pains me to say this as a lawyer, the courts will not save us, right? Like, we are going to have to save ourselves in a variety of ways that I think we did a lot of the times that my esteemed co-panelists are discussing, and we're going to have to turn to other mechanisms to fight the wave that's coming.
Thank you.
Carl, some of your last comments actually dovetail perfectly with what I wanted to ask about, which was sort of in the quest for liberation, as each of you see it, what is the balance between seeking sort of both recognition and protection through the state, and knowing that we need to go outside of the state, actually, to sort of seek freedom in broader senses? So I'd love to sort of hear from each of you about that.
I want to go back to the previous question for just a second. I'm not surprised because of the way our quote-unquote success the media has treated it. And the fact that I remember the day that I realized there were gay Republicans, I, as a little radical, didn't think that was possible. And seriously, I'm being really frank here. And then I realized that, it was about class. I mean, the words that we weren't using anymore. The crisis in capital right now, and the redundancy among educated people, there are not enough jobs. Try to get your PhD in queer studies and see just how many jobs are available. For example, I'm serious because there's serious students that are going after that, and where are they going to be? They're going to try to get Anne's job, That's what's going to happen. It's going to be competition. So to looking at that, and then who are scapegoated? There's always needs to be a scapegoat. Right now it's immigrants. And Charles and some of the trans activists, lawyers that have been working on immigration have brought forward how trans immigrants, are being treated. But across the board, we hear of black trans women. There were 7 recently that were murdered in 1 week. But how many women actually get murdered in gun violence in 1 week, in domestic situations? How many sex workers, male or female, heterosexual or trans, get murdered in 1 week? And what happens is it begins to build tension among the people that should not, I feel, have tension. My goal today, and I'll say it to you, the right to be different is critical, because we are different to someone else. Almost all of us up here is different to each other. And where does hate or dismissal or fear come from? Well, some of it comes from the economic situation we're in now. I want to see a guaranteed income. I think that's one of the ways we can equalize out. Who's going to buy all this product if we don't have any money? The middle class has been wiped out. I mean, this is the multi-issue politics of the Gay Liberation Front. It's just not about my right to love. But I want to say to you, Stonewall, what happened that night was about the right to love, the right to have sex. It wasn't about all the other issues. They came along as we began to realize the diversity of who this community was. And everybody wasn't a gay white man and middle class.
Can I just say something to the question you asked,
Yes,
which I think
please.
is a really important one? And I'm really curious also what Carl has to say about this, since you're having to articulate, to the law, which is about speaking to the state. It seems to me that we have to speak to the state and ask for recognition. But I think one of the dilemmas is, and they think this is about the question of opening up our imagination, that's one place to focus. It can't be the end point. Because if we aim our speech at the state and aim our activism at the state, we're ceding to the state's terms, which are very narrow, very limited, and more so every day. And it's a state that's utterly enthralled to neoliberalism, which really wants to task individuals with the obligation to actually take on burdens that the government used to provide for, right? Like, one of the reasons the state actually likes same-sex marriage, which is among the reasons why I think that it might be here to stay, is same-sex marriage actually becomes one of the ways in which the state can say, fine, you two take care of each other now, right? So we need to speak to the state. We have to ask for basic protections, and often using the state's language. But we always have to speak outside the law, that is not in the terms that the law requires, at the same time, more expansively. So even a lawyer can speak a different language when not at the bar, right? I mean, maybe at a gay bar you speak a different language, right? Does this make sense that we have to be at the minimum bilingual, hopefully trilingual, maybe TRY lingual, right? We really have to imagine beyond what the narrow things the law can give us, even as we demand more from the state than we're currently getting. But it can't be the limit. And this is, again, I know I have a critique of same-sex marriage, but I also think that to the extent that the state was going to offer these things, it has to offer it equally, but it's not enough. What other relational forms should the state be supporting? So many more relational forms exist already that the state doesn't recognize. We can't give up on those because they were sustaining for so many generations, not just for queer people, but I'm thinking during slavery, in the wake of slavery, forms of Black cultural life, which were not, the state didn't recognize, right? That we have to think about the relational forms that have made survival and flourishing possible. And the law can't give us that language.
Thank you. Questions? Sir?
Yes, hi. Thank you for coming and having this dialogue. There is so much to talk about under this umbrella, this LGBT umbrella. Mr. White and anybody who has any input, how many people of color were at Stonewall? And the reason why I asked is because I think that brown and black folks need to have their own stories. We need to have our own stories saved. No disrespect to you, sir, but I've read and I've heard that there were brown and black folks who actually sparked the revolt against the police. With that said, there is, in my observation, there's a division still now, present day, between our white counterparts and black and brown. The economic, you mentioned economic. So I live in the Bronx. We don't have the same resources as our white counterparts in Manhattan. That's something to continue to talk about, and we need more resources.
I just want to answer the question about who was at Stonewall and what we hear, who was the Stormy Dalbelier, was not at Stonewall that first night. She was a friend of mine. But the need to have representation is built, the myth that Charles says is so important. But we want to talk about racism. And racism in New York City, and even in Greenwich Village, and the way the mob organized their clubs. Stonewall Inn was a white club. It was a white gay men's club. It was a... That's not my experience. I mean, you and I may have gone there at different nights or different times. My experience...
Well, that's why I stopped going to Stonewall, is because it had been taken over by black people. I didn't want to go anymore. They were called A trainers because they came down on the A train from Harlem. And those were the kids who were in there. And the white kids would have run away, but black and brown kids fought back because they were used to fighting the cops.
We had a different experience. The black and brown kids that came down, and this is before Christopher Street and the PATH train brought people in from Newark and from New Jersey, were hanging out with Tommy Langdon Schmidt in the little park because they were underage and they weren't appropriately mannered to go into the Stonewall.
Well, it is possible there were different populations on different evenings in one bar.
And if you look at the photographs of the time, you see that about 1/4 of the people in the photographs taken by Fred Dara were white, and the rest were black and brown.
Not true. Let's look at the photographs together. Now, Ed, that's his experience, and I'm telling you my experience. I'm not, disrespectful to him and his experience, but my experience was not the same as yours.
We're in a good Maoist conscience.
But I want to talk about racism. I want to talk about racism and how the clubs were run by the mob. And that club was a place for drug transactions and sexual bargainings. Okay, that was my
You say hustlers and you say drugs. I never saw any of that, and I went there all the time.
You're such an innocent. Okay. No, I don't want to diminish what Ed is. See, this is how the stories happen. This is how the stories
different
happen.
witnesses do see different things, Jim. It is possible that he had a different experience than you did.
But racism, I want to talk about racism to your question. There were black, gay, and lesbian bars. They were in Times Square and Harlem. Now, some white men would go to their bars because they wanted to interact with people of color. But the organized crime organized these bars in a particular kind of way. And I think it's important to understand that. Why do you only see white faces at that period of time? With due respect to Fred McDarra's photographs. Fred was a friend, and I looked at those photographs. But there's a very famous Peter Hujar photograph of white people running down the street. It says, "Join the Sisters and Brothers of the Gay Liberation Front." The way that photograph was put together, at 4 meetings of the Gay Liberation Front, it was announced, anyone who wants to be in this photograph, yes, I'm in that. I'm white. Anyone who wants to come and be in that photograph. We wanted a recruitment photograph. This is in October of 1969. They said, we recruit. We wanted to say, damn right we recruit. Come join us. 3 people of color. First one was Ron Ballard. He rounded the corner, it was in Soho, it wasn't in Chelsea. And he got off the train on Spring Street, round the corner, and he saw all of us down there waiting to do the shoot. And then he saw his grandmother. This is what he told me. He saw his grandmother. and he wasn't out to his grandmother, and he turned around and left. And I remember he told me the story. I was pissed at him. I wanted, white people wanted the representation of black people because we were multicultural, and the second person was a woman of color. She rounded the corner, and she suddenly realized that her grandmother and her mother had worked as domestics to put her through college, and she was a teacher. And she suddenly realized she could lose her job because of being in this photograph. And her grandmother and her mother had worked so hard to get her to that point. So when I heard these stories, I learned something. I learned about dual oppression, and there's triple oppression, different kinds of oppression. But I, as a white working class person, had not realized how this white skin gave me privileges which I didn't think I had, And I think that that's the question of racism. It's a very difficult one to navigate because I saw a documentary by Rob Epstein and Jeffrey Friedman, which is on YouTube, and it's called The States of Pride. And there's a young black trans woman in Alabama who is talking about how glad she was that Sylvia and Marsha were there, and they were the leaders, and they threw the rock, and they did all. And I'm sitting there thinking, well, that's not true, that's not true, what's not true? And watching her come alive, she felt that she was represented, that she was there. And that's, I'm really challenged by this.
But they were
Charles.
certainly active after
Oh,
Stonewall.
no. They were, well, Sylvia was, yes.
Yeah.
They were part of the Gay Liberation Front. They started Street Transvestite
That's
Action.
at least as important as where they were that night, in my opinion, what they did afterwards.
Agreed, and I always talk to that.
Any more questions? Andrew.
Hi. Oh no, that's really loud. I'm so sorry. I'm just gonna stand. Okay. Hi, my name is Andrew. I go to Hunter. So I was actually wondering that. So the law often comes up as a topic in how to navigate or really advocate on behalf of communities. So I was thinking in this case, and especially in American law, oh, please don't take pictures. I'm sorry. And especially in terms of American law, I always feel as if law de facto is really behind in terms of law de jure, maybe. At least that's my own experience. Correct me if I'm wrong, in that it feels as if culturally, sometimes we are more ahead of like very archaic, old laws that don't really progress easily, and we always have to keep coming up with different interpretations of these old laws in order to accommodate for advances. And again, correct me if I'm wrong. I'm 20. I don't know too much. But I'm just wondering because I understand that the law can be used as an instrument for social change, and it is very limited in how it can be used as a tool or an instrument. I guess like what I'm trying to ask is that specifically in terms of a policy discussion, how the law can be used in the future, hopefully if the courts are failing us or are going to fail us given all of the new appointments, how young people can look forward to the law or can look forward to the structure of the state. Because I understand there are very much limitations in that, but there have been legislation that has been passed to try and protect LGBT folk. So that's my question. Thank you.
Carl, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I'll echo Anne here and say that we have to do as much as we can within the framework while acknowledging that the framework is not sufficient. I'm thinking in particular about the victory of Tiffany Caban in Queens in the Democratic primary for Queens DA that happened last week. Tuesday. Sorry, days this week are just like blurred together. And I think that we are seeing folks, in particular leaders of color, young queer folks coming up and showing us that we can reimagine the law in ways that previously we had not conceptualized. So I appreciate, Andrew, your enthusiasm and your optimism about what we can do, and I do share that to an extent. I think, I was maybe a little overly bleak previously, but I'm taking a lot of inspiration and encouragement from the people I see who are thinking creatively about things we can do to change the laws, right? So, for example, Tiffany Caban has said that she will center the decriminalization of sex work in New York. That will be a primary part of her platform, and I think that is an avenue towards future justice that we can look to as a creative avenue to supporting all people in our community. So,
Thank you. And please give a great big pride thank you to our wonderful panel.